Dreadful media twats, dreadful media twats, dreadful, dreadful, dreadful twats, terrible, dreadful media twats, dreadful, 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 dreadful twats. So it's dreadful, 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 dreadful media twats. Dreadful media twats, dreadful media twats, dreadful, dreadful media twats.
Moving on to the someone who doesn't like to get his hands dirty, but is a thoroughly filthy individual. George Monbiot. It's difficult to know where to begin. It's difficult to know where to begin with this individual. He is someone who, for many years, he had a kind of dissident credentials because he was talking a lot about how the media didn't cover climate change, and he was breaking the golden rule of mainstream journalism is that you don't criticize other news outlets or quote unquote journalists for their shoddy reporting. But he also wrote a lot about the kind of energy interests which were at the core of the Balkan conflicts, and Iraq. And other, kind of skirmishes in the Middle East. Although he was always very quick to state that, well, while oil is the preponderant reason we invaded Iraq, there were other reasons too, like humanitarian concerns and a desire to end tyranny in the Middle East and blah, blah, blah. But he kind of jettisoned that mask of faux radicalism entirely when the Syrian proxy war erupted, and he became an absolutely rabid tub thumper for direct intervention in Syria, and was attacking anyone who was opposed to intervention, and indeed people who were raising questions about the aforementioned staged chemical weapons attacks as apologists for genocide, for fascism, as Assadists, and every name under the sun. It must be and this is we'll get into this in more detail in a sec, but it must be stated that he's now a rabid tub thumper for the Ukrainian proxy war, and is accusing people who want to end it of appeasement, and with allusions to appeasing Hitler by conducting peace negotiations with Putin. All of these conflicts that he supports are creating environmental destruction on an absolutely grand scale. So it's a bit odd that a committed environmentalist is so keen on them.
Well, yes, but I think the thing that gets Monbiot going more than even the soil of his wholly organic farm is, of course, the prospect of conquering the foreign hordes on behalf of British imperialism. Now, Monbiot, as you indicate, Kit, in your opening there, has a reputation still to this day amongst people who I converse with, who regard themselves as radical left-wingers, as something of a truth teller, because he's been around for quite a long time now, almost 30-odd years, and he's been a fixture at The Guardian. He's written books, one of which I read, actually, about the privatization of Britain. But as you said, he has moved more and more openly to becoming a more and more rabid supporter of British military interventions around the world. He wrote this, as you can see on screen here, dear viewers, a ludicrous article back in February of this year, stating, if the US is now our enemy, how do we defend ourselves? Which, of course, is a complete fantasia. But in it, he reveals a lot of the key fantasies of the part of the British ruling class upon whose behalf he speaks. And I say this because through doing the research for this episode, we were looking through the output of the sort of clownish right wingers like Debretton Gordon and Kemp, establishment mouthpieces like Urban and Bowen, and now left wingers like Monbiot and other people we'll come to in just a moment. And what you see actually is a remarkable consistency of opinion. How they express the opinions of the British establishment is, of course, different. For Kemp and Debretton Gordon, it'll be flag-waving, tub-thumping, rule Britannia stuff. With George Monbiot, it'll be we must overthrow Assad for reasons of human rights and environmentalism, petropopulism, bad, overthrow Maduro, etc. But in reality, it's the same message underneath it all. It's the same set of interests that they're serving. The dictatorship of the bourgeoisie in any country, but especially an imperialist one, has a left, it has a right. And the two of them, whilst pretending to fight each other on all kinds of things, actually, in actual fact, converge. And George Monbiot's career is a perfect example of that. His view on Syria, his view on Ukraine, it's the same as Kemp's. It's the same as de Bretton Gordon's. It's just like he stresses it differently. And his job is to capture people who become critical of the system and maybe encounter his very heavily promoted videos on YouTube, by the way. His stuff for like Double Down News gets huge viewing figures because he's pushed by the algorithm precisely so that you, as somebody who's becoming critical of the British establishment, you read George Monbiot, you start to trust George Monbiot. By the way, it's the same role played by Owen Jones and Paul Mason. But, Mason's reputation is now beshitted, partially thanks to the efforts of my co-host here. So he's not a sort of bankable commodity anymore, but Monbiot is. So you read his stuff criticizing, British policies internally. He even criticizes the external policies. But and he gets to the fundamental interests of British imperialism, then George is all in. He's manning the guns himself, metaphorically speaking. He'd never go near one, I'm sure, in real life. And the point of him is to lead you into supporting the fundamental interests of British imperialism whilst thinking that you're engaging in criticism of the British state. Because one of the things we learned, well, I learned actually, you, Kit, might have come across this earlier as a reporter, from the special military operation in Ukraine, is that you learn what are the most important things to the British ruling class by the amount of media uniformity and political uniformity that are imposed upon the system. Like for Ukraine, there's still, to this day, almost zero dissent breaking out in the British media and political class. None. There was a brief mumbled mention of peace in Ukraine by Jeremy Corbyn recently at the rather, shall we say, cartoonish Your Party launch conference. That's about it. Everybody else remains either fully on board with the fantasies of the British ruling class or silent about them. And George Monbiot, as we will see in just a moment, has not been silent about them. He has been a rabid enthusiast for the Ukraine war, which, of course, is part of his purpose as a long-serving media twat. So before I throw back to you, Kit, I'm just going to bring up George's thing and raving live on a BBC Question contribution, where he defended the Ukraine war and called for war, and more war in perpetuity in answer to, I believe it was an encounter with the conservative academic Matthew Goodwin. So just going to share this with the good listeners and viewers now. Health warning: a prolonged exposure to Monbiot can lead to profound vibration of the ears and massive anal leakage. So do beware. So
Trump has basically said you can have what you want. Ukraine's not going to be a member of NATO. There's not going to be any territorial concessions back to Ukraine. And that says to Putin, right, Moldova next. Who knows? Romania, maybe. Poland. Let's have a look at those Baltic states.
What about Matt's points, which is, Ukraine was in a state of slow losing, you could argue, because it wasn't getting enough money and enough weapons to really, really defeat Russia. And meanwhile, thousands and thousands of people are dying. Matt's point is, at least he's doing something, and he's in your view, showing strength.
Well, there are Chamberlains in every generation.
Oh, here we go.
And this is a Beavers. This is direct. So he's built an aggressor of someone who. Right. Just a moment. This is direct appeasement of someone who has moved into a sovereign country, seized its territory, sought to seize the entire country. And it's as if, he'd come to the UK, he'd occupied Kent, Surrey, Sussex. And then somebody else like Donald Trump comes along and says, yeah, fine, guys, just live with that. No trouble at all. These people who go on and on about sovereignty, say they're the defenders of sovereignty. When it actually comes to the crunch, they will sell anyone down the river. So, George, sorry, you have it.
Right, so I think that's more than enough of George there. But the key point to get out of that is they're indistinguishable from something that like Richard Kemp or Hamish de Bretton Gordon or the aforementioned on previous episodes, Tobias Ellwood would come out with. And again, that's Monbiot's role. He reels you in with his mild criticism of the banking system and environmentalism, and then he gets you with that, and the hope is that you go along with him. But Kit, did you have any reflections on George, the environmentally friendly, belligerent militarist?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that I'm glad that you cut that short when you did, because it was, I was at risk of suffering all of the side effects that you mentioned, and we might have had to end the broadcast prematurely. But I just think that what you missed was that that he subsequent to this rant about appeasement, etc., and how this is sovereign territory, blah 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 blah. Of course, number one, NATO, and this is like openly admitted in the media now. NATO wrenched Kosovo out of Serbia via its illegal 1999 bombing campaign. So, I mean, irrespective of his position on that, and he was critical of the, as I mentioned, to a degree, Western meddling in the Balkans. Apparently, it's from his perspective, it's still okay when we do this. He certainly didn't raise similar complaints about NATO effectively seizing and occupying another country's territory, but using brute force. But he is asked what his solution is to this kind of completely unwinnable quagmire that he supports, and he literally says, "Just keep going," because it's been such a success, hasn't it, for everyone involved, bar Russia. It's been a complete and utter disaster, and his only response is send them more weapons that we don't have, send them more money that we don't have, keep this going on at a completely unsustainable human and material cost. When I might add, according to opinion polls, the overwhelming majority of the Ukrainians want this over at all costs and are willing to make serious concessions if it brings peace. So it's like, yeah, as you say, he is a very, and I think Media Lens, which is a great website that does, like media analysis, which is very lacking otherwise. They have talked about how, Monbiot is, he serves this very insidious purpose of, he lures in radicals with some of his reporting and some of his rhetoric, and then once you're kind of ensconced in his in his lair, as it were, he then hits you with like straight up imperialist talking points, as if this is somehow likewise like a radical position. He's far from alone from this in the media, but it's very, 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 very poisonous. And I think that in terms of like, he's probably, out of all of the people that we featured so far, he's probably the most dangerous, because actually his positions are basically indivisible from Mark Urban's, from Hamish de Bretton Gordon, from Richard Kemp, and yet it is wrapped up in this rhetoric, which and this framing, which can appeal to people who are possessed of dissenting viewpoints, and that's much more dangerous than, with Hamish de Bretton Gordon, you know what you're getting. He is a British military veteran who writes for the most hardcore pro-Ukraine right-wing newspaper in Britain. like with Monbiot, he still manages to retain some semblance of radical credentials. You know, and it's like, it's a bit like, yeah, come for the fiery condemnations of government inaction on climate change, stay for the justification for absolutely brutal, destructive proxy wars. And yeah, he in the same vein, our next twat, Simon Tisdall, is, I think that he's someone who, I'm shocked that he's still employed by the Guardian. Now, I actually, it's interesting. They recently changed his profile photo. So for many years, he appeared, his accompanying kind of headshot is his columns. He looked, you know, kind of like he was getting on a bit, but still, you know, bright-eyed and with a relatively decent remaining head of hair. And now in his more recently, they've updated this to reflect what he actually looks like, which is like Nosferatu. And I think it's very, very bit that Tisdall has a history of, you know, likewise, basically pushing state narratives, but, you know, from this alleged, like, you know, left wing perspective. And you know, he's recently written columns about how, oh well, you know, the US is retreating from the Middle East, and on you know, the kind of top line, it seems like he's recognizing that, you know, America is in a state of decline and that this is a good thing. But then he hits you with, well, this is terrible because it creates a vacuum that Russia and China and other evil, you know, like enemy states are going to exploit. So, you know, this is like a really bad thing. And I might add as well that he from the very start of the proxy war, he has been banging the drum that Russia's next target is the Balkans. And as we've, you know, discussed on the show, this is a narrative that the British government has been pushing likewise throughout the proxy war, and they have used it to justify deploying tens of thousands, at least thousands more quote unquote peacekeepers to flashpoints like Bosnia and Kosovo, where, you know, a stray trigger pull could easily cause a serious conflict. And, you know, I mean, there are, you know, Russia, it doesn't even border these countries, and let alone has, you know, the necessary capabilities to invade them without, you know, being stopped in their tracks one way or another, because they would have to fly through, you know, closed and protected airspace to get soldiers there. And then yet there are, you know, vast amounts of foreign forces in the region, allegedly guarding against invasion. I mean, these are the people who've actually invaded. And Tisdall was, there are you can find numerous columns where he states like, oh, we should be looking at the threat that Serbia poses to Europe, the threat of Russian involvement in Bosnia, where you know, Bosnian politicians talk about how the biggest threat. They talk in Parliament about how the biggest threat to them is Britain, because Sarajevo is drowning in MI6 officers up to no good. You know, so that's kind of where he's at.
Well, I wanted just to dive into this article, which is typical of Mr. Tisdall's oeuvre, which is basically a call for even more U.S. aggression against China. Because the big thing that all of these liberal and leftist critics of Trump really get angry about is that he's not a competent enough administrator of imperialism. That's really the actual substance of their complaint about him, and it always was. That he was too unpredictable, that he might do something that, you know, that threatens the system accidentally, that he's not going to be aggressive enough with the Chinese, or he's not going to be aggressive enough with the Russians. Again, that's the argument that George Monbiot was getting so agitated about on that Question Time clip we just showed you, which is that Trump's not militarist and aggressive enough. And I wanted just to go down to Tisdall's conclusion here, which is worth reading, which reads as follows. As in Czechoslovakia in 1938, so in Ukraine, and now, prospectively in Taiwan, History has proven that compromising with aggression only brings war and enslavement, Lai warned. That's the Taiwanese president. But Trump doesn't read history. His ignorance kills. Now, I do read history, as does my comrade and co-host here. And I know the actual history of why Britain gave Czechoslovakia to Hitler in 1930. And they gave Czechoslovakia to Hitler, by the way, ignoring an offer from the Soviet leadership to actually provide 1 million men to not only defend Czechoslovak sovereignty, but actually form a coalition against Hitler. The British turned that down. The British gave Czechoslovakia to Hitler in 1938, and of course the French were fully on board with this, in order to satisfy their project in Germany. And Hitler was invested in very heavily by the British ruling class for a number of years, and in the hope that the next move that old Adolf would make would be eastwards, would be to go at the Soviet Union directly. Now, eventually, of course, Chamberlain, who was always acting in the interests of the British ruling class, declared war tokenistically on Germany after the Germans stormed into Poland. The Soviets were trying to negotiate an alliance against Germany with the British right up until the last minute, when the Molotov and Stalin came to the realization that the British were not only not serious about it, but actually wanted the Germans to attack the Soviet Union in order to weaken, well, both sides in the end, but ideally that they wanted the Germans to destroy the Soviet Union, get weakened in the process of doing so, then the British could take them out afterwards. Munich is used by people like Tisdall as this terrible surrender to tyranny, whereas in actual fact, it was the British ruling class doing what it's always done, which is try to turn its major enemies against each other, which, of course, Hitler was always going to do anyway. And it's the reason why they backed Hitler in the first place. So again, like this misappropriation and this misusage of history by people like Tisdall to justify imperialist aggression, like completely distorts the actual history, which is of the mendacity of the British ruling class, the fact that there's nobody that they won't sell out, the fact that their priority at the time was to turn the Nazis on the USSR, and it remained a priority for them even after they'd had a formal alliance with the USSR. So Tisdall is this sort of classic, along with looking like he sucks the blood of interns, and maybe he does, allegedly. He is the sort of classic leftist commentator in the pages of The Guardian. And he's had a long career at The Guardian, going back to the late 70s. So you don't get to have that kind of career in any major British media organization unless you are providing very good services to the British establishment, which Tisdall undoubtedly is. Now, did you have anything to add on Tisdall, or should we move on to our next Guardian twat?
Yeah, I think that's next Guardian twat. Let's do it.
Well, the next one up on this particular list of absolutes, a certain Mr. Timothy Garton Ash. Now, Timothy Garton Ash is a curious figure. He's a sort of more of an academic sort, wannabe historian, or long-time Guardian opinion piece writer. But him out because, as well as having all the opinions as Tisdall, Monbiot, Kemp, and Bretton Gordon, even though some of those would profess to hate each other, he's a little bit more open about the kind of things he's in favor of. See, we covered recently the Czech elections and the coming back to power of an EU, sort of a critic of the EU. Now, this has worried Timothy Garton Ash, who's, of course, a long-time, very enthusiastic supporter of the European Union. And he's an enthusiastic supporter of it from the point of view that it actually makes, shall we say, democratic deviations from the line of the British ruling class more difficult. And in this article, he's actually very about what he wants, which is he wants to use the judiciary in Britain and elsewhere, and he wants to use broadcast media and other pillars of the establishment to actually make sure that the progress of what he refers to as populist forces is frustrated. In the article, he mentions, of course, Calin Georgescu, who was, of course, stopped from winning the presidential election in Romania, and he openly endorses the idea of like judicial blockage of populist forces, arguing, Orban has undermined democracy in Hungary. Because for people like him, and this is why he's a little bit more honest, democracy doesn't mean the population getting to vote on who their leader should be. Democracy means essentially the defense of the Western order and the defense of it by any means necessary, because only the Western order represents democracy. In this sense, he's a true successor to the actual writers of the Enlightenment period, in that he doesn't believe that the plebs, the proles, the masses, the scum should be actually entitled to the vote. Not really. Or certainly if they do vote, that the establishment should have, shall we say, a lot of earthworks in between their votes and the ability to change anything. And that's fairly typical of like the kind of person that cried when Hillary Clinton lost and still believes or still pretends to believe in Russiagate to this day. That's the kind of person that Timothy Garton Ash is, and that's who he writes for. A Guardian reading cycling dad demographic, I think, or centrist dad demographic is the kind of audience he has. Kit, did you have anything to add on the Mr. Garton Ash, who was, of course, a very enthusiastic supporter of all the Balkan Wars?
I mean, yeah, it's difficult to know where to begin with this real piece of work, but I think that things to bear in mind about his long-running career in the media. I don't think he would necessarily refer to himself as a journalist, and he certainly doesn't fit, the actual definition of one. But what's really interesting is that he studied in East Germany as an exchange student, and that he was doing a PhD at Oxford on Nazi rule, and he dropped it to do a PhD about the German Democratic Republic. Therefore furthering this bullshit, poisonous narrative that communism and Nazism were, comparable totalitarianisms in his own parlance. And he was suspected of being spied by the Stasi, who kept him under surveillance. And even though he denies ever having been a British intelligence operative, he nonetheless boasts about how while he was in the GDR, he was a soldier behind enemy lines. So, make of that what you will. It's really interesting as well that Margaret Thatcher referred to him as one of her favourite historians, and would consult him on matters related to German reunification in the early 90s. And in a bitter irony as well is that he was a rabid advocate of the breakup of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, and thought that, well, at least claimed to believe that the overthrow, the collapse of communism in 1989 in Poland and elsewhere would lead to this sparkling dawn of freedom and democracy and human rights and liberalism and blah blah. And then when these countries, which were broken up due to the sponsorship of nationalism by the Anglo-Americans, both covertly and overtly. When these countries turned massively right-wing and nationalist, he was unhappy about it. He was unhappy about the direct result of what he was advocating for happening. Which was completely foreseeable and predictable, and he complains about it to this day. And yes, he believes that we need to what we need to do to prevent leaders like Viktor Orban or Robert Fico or people who, to an extent, do try and stand up for their national self-interest. He thinks that the best way to prevent this from happening is create these completely unchangeable state structures which ensure continuity of policy irrespective of who's democratically elected. And then yet he is very keen to play up his liberal credentials. So I mean, yeah, he is again a classic example of a Trojan horse who poses as poses as a radical when actually what he's advocating is counter-revolutionary repression, persecution of dissidents, and just like creating this homogenous monolith of countries that just do whatever they're told by the British and the Americans and don't cause any problems.
Well, I think that this is where we will pivot in the show. We will pivot towards a series of figures in the British media who are perhaps less well known, but nonetheless twattish. We begin with a man who, if you had to draw like a young conservative who morphs very quickly into an old conservative, you draw this little shit, Sebastian Payne, whose existence I'd actually know about until comrade co-host here notified her that he wanted to include him in the show today, and now I feel like my life is poorer as a result. It's like this is the classic working guy from a working class background who basically shits on his own class and his own origins, but in order to advance up the slippery, greasy pole of the Conservative Party. You might be thinking of going reform now, but here he whines about how he wasn't selected as an MP for the last election. Maybe he can have a go with Nigel's boys next time around. But Kit, why did you want to include good old Steb here?
Well, I mean, I think that he is an almost perfect manifestation of media chumocracy, and he's a class traitor. He comes from a working class background, but then went to Durham, which is this very elite university, and then immediately upon leaving, he somehow secured a series of high-level roles at the Telegraph, at the Spectator, at the Financial Times. He was I think he was the Spectator's online editor, like fresh out of uni when he was in his early 20s, which I think speaks volumes about the quality of talent that these outlets are looking for. He is like that Harry Enfield character, Tim Nice but Dim. Or indeed Tory boy, and I used to his reporting became something of a figure of fun for certain elements of the British left, because he was literally just writing down unquestioningly whatever the Tories told him. And I remember there was a particularly pathetic bit of propaganda for Theresa May of all people. Does anyone remember her? Where he, in not long after she became leader in 2016, following David Cameron's resignation, he wrote this article where he was boasting about how he had a lovely lunch with Theresa May's people, presumably at some very expensive central London restaurant, and his scoop, quote unquote, was that Theresa May was going to be much more about substance than style. Because it's of course, politicians would act to say I'm much more about style than substance, wouldn't they? And so he spent his entire career at the upper echelons of the media, chatting absolute rubbish, appearing on Question Time, being interviewed as a quote unquote expert on all sorts of issues when he couldn't tell his arse from his elbow, quit journalism to join a think tank and prepare for Parliament. He was kind of following, Michael Gove's example of being a mainstream client journalist and then becoming an MP. And then hilariously, he failed to get any nomination, despite being tapped for a variety of what were thought to be at least relatively safe seats. His record, his first-hand account of failing to become an MP is pretty hilarious. In the opening paragraph, he states that he was delivered a question with razor precision that sunk his hopes of securing the nomination for that particular constituency. And a woman asked him, was beginning with some warm words while strapping the verbal arrow into her crossbow, asked, "How many times have you actually campaigned in Surrey Heath before?" Bullseye. I heard my partner's sharp intake as I spoke about all of the door knocking I'd undertaken since deciding to try to become a Conservative MP. And it's like, yeah, that he was much like Paul Mason running for like 5 or 6 separate constituencies. He was like desperately carpetbagging to get a safe seat. He didn't end up getting one in the end, and it's whining, oh me, poor me. I was robbed of my lifelong ambition to become Michael Gove. It's I wouldn't recommend reading it in full because it's kind of nauseating. But he's now back in journalism as a senior writer at the Times. But it's like, yeah, I just do it's an interesting. He's a very interesting example of how if you have the right connections and you go to the right universities and or schools, as we discussed in the introduction, then you are made for life in the media. I mean, I remember when I graduated the same year that he did, and I, looked at briefly the job openings with newspapers large and small, and it was basically impossible to get on an interview if you didn't have a 2-1 in PPE from a top university. Like, that was the criteria that they were looking for. It didn't matter if you had a writing background or if you'd studied, even had like a journalism degree. You had to have gone to a top university. And the second that he was in there, it was this stratospheric rise to the upper echelons of these publications, irrespective of his total underlying lack of talent. It's interesting that you hadn't heard of him before because, as I say, I think there are certain people that I know who kind of keep an eye on media twats in the right wing sector, and he looms fairly prominently in their sights as a figure of ridicule, and quite rightly. Although it's not at all funny because he does clearly have some influence and a position of some power, even if it's just impotently serving as the press office of the Tory party. This is the state of British journalism. These are the kind of people who get cushy jobs in the field.
Now, before we move on, honourable mention to the graduates of Vice News. I think we have to just acknowledge that, though we could probably spend about 2 hours talking about them, because never has the connections between countercultural journalism and the intelligence services been more clearly spelt out by the career of many of Vice News' graduates. Perhaps it will be worthy of a special in and of itself in the near future. But talking of more edgy characters, talking of characters who like to portray themselves as having a degree more independence, perhaps, or perhaps even being critical of the system, we turn to a gentleman called James Bloodworth. And like many of the people on this list, he has a storied career, starting as a Trotskyite tit and then becoming a establishment tub thumper. And you can see here a Twitter encounter between him and yourself, Kit, from a couple of years ago, in which he repeatedly calls you a Russian asset without ever providing any proof of this, and then refuses pointedly to answer any straightforward questions. So do you want to elucidate further to the audience, like, what is a James Bloodworth and why should anybody care?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that he actually was someone who he hadn't really cropped up on my radar beyond notably being amongst the very first people to push the Corbyn is anti-Semitic bullshit before Corbyn was even leader. And another person who did this is the rather creepy and spooky Oliver Camm. who we've actually omitted from our list of twats, but probably should have been on there. And I thought it was very funny that he got extremely angry that Unheard published me. They wanted me writing a weekly column. I wrote 3 pieces for them before they basically told me to F off because someone had a word with them, because they are, relatively mainstream in the scheme of things, and you can't have someone like me contributing to them. And I thought it was very interesting that I specifically challenged him about his close friendship with Nick Cohen, who we'll get into, who was fired from The Guardian at long last in mid 2023 after years of allegations of him sexually harassing, assaulting, and attempting to rape female staffers at The Guardian. And he repeatedly refused to condemn Nick Cohen's actions and said, "I'm not responsible for how anybody else conducts themselves. What a stupid point." Which is rather undermined by the fact that his attack on Corbyn was headlined, "Why is no one asking about Jeremy Corbyn's worrying connections?" Which is to say, he was smearing Corbyn on the basis of the alleged conduct of other people. So yeah, I mean, Bloodworth he's not even an interesting figure, but he's a classic example of a very common trend, which is he claims to be left wing and progressive, and plays at being the true voice of the working class and writing about issues affecting the working class, while relentlessly bashing anyone who's actually on the left, even vaguely, as being lunatics, as being anti-Semites, as being apologists for oppressive regimes, as having completely insane, unworkable fantasy policies that they advocate for, and also as well, what is quite curious about James Bloodworth is he is someone who is frequently interviewed on mainstream news programs. He is never short of work. He's written for pretty much every mainstream media outlet there is, ranging from The Guardian to The Telegraph, and he gets numerous book deals, and his books get almost universally praised in the mainstream. If you actually visit his website, it's quite clear that he doesn't actually have any organic support at all. Like, he struggles to at times breach double-digit likes on a blog post. So it's quite clear that, like, actually in the real world, no one is organically interested in what he has to say. And which is quite an extraordinary thing. And it does. I mean, not long after our set to, he was posting selfies of himself in Ukraine. So, I mean, maybe there's something spooky lying behind his seemingly impervious position, within the media. But he is a single example of a much wider trend of people who claim to be left wing and then actually do everything in their power to prevent any meaningful change happening whatsoever, and ensuring that the Tories remain in power forever, or if not, that Labour just completely emulates and copies the Conservatives on every conceivable issue. Now, this is our next twat is yet another example of this tendency. James Ball, a former Home Office intern, whether that's MI5, we can only speculate, and a proud PPE graduate. He has made his career by throwing Julian Assange under the bus and talking about, he even wrote, again, he's someone who writes a lot of books and is frequently on TV, and doesn't seem to have any actual like serious public. I don't think anyone is serious. I literally think that the number of people who are like, oh, I wonder what James Ball's take is on this issue is zero. Like, and yeah, it was just one of them. I think this is one of his more infamous examples of throwing Julian Assange under the bus, because he worked briefly for WikiLeaks, and I gather from people I connected to WikiLeaks while Ball was part of it. He was only for a few months, very briefly, and they relayed how he boasted about how he sat at the top tables at Oxford and how he'd always wanted to work for the intelligence services. And like, so yeah, he spent many years, and he was doing this, recently, around the time that Julian was finally released from Belmarsh, just throwing Julian Assange under the bus and saying that he's a dangerous individual and that he is a threat to journalism, and that, and every smear under the sun. And then, having built this career based on bashing Julian Assange, he is shocked when the FBI contacts him and asks, "Do you want to testify against Julian at his trial?" Because shock horror that he would rank very highly as someone that you would want to testify against Julian Assange. So yeah, he's an absolute scumbag. Yet again, runs a Substack which gets even less traction than James Bloodworth's. But yet again, somehow James Ball is multi-award-winning journalist, never struggles to find work. Has written for, again, most newspapers under the sun. Was worked for the Guardian for many years, etc. Again, we must ask whether he is to an extent protected, because he certainly doesn't owe his awards and position and platform to merit or skill or anything positive.
Now, speaking of someone who has absolutely nothing positive to contribute, and indeed had a strange permanent presence within the media for an awful lot of time. In fact, I remember him being portrayed as the big left-wing critic of the Blair administration back in the early 2000s. And that is, of course, a certain Nick Cohen, who now is known principally as sex pest, and his reputation is justifiably shredded. But it took an awful long time for Nick Cohen to go down in flames. And the reasons why, of course, is that, along with the rest of our media twat, he was a protected, chosen man for a long time when he was considered to be on the left, and then when he graduated over to the right, same thing applies. He was a chosen man of the establishment, and when you're a chosen man of the establishment, you get to do all kinds of things and get away with it, including attempted rape, groping, and I think they rather delicately entitled unwanted sexual advances. Now, in the time of Me Too and in the time of greater focusing on these things, eventually Cohen's past as a serial sex pest caught up with it. But he got away with this for almost a generation, didn't he?
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually played a role in his downfall, and I was back in 2019 and 2020. I was in touch with a number of Cohen's victims, who made a number of pretty startling disclosures, not just about his sexual abuse of them, but also the way that they were treated by their peers and indeed their superiors. There was one victim I spoke to who was told by someone they considered a friend at the Guardian, when she had been groped by Cohen and saying, I'm gonna report him for this. Because it was horrendous. Their friend said, well, I mean, look, everybody here knows about this, that he does this. Nothing ever happens. And if you do go to management, you're probably going to get fired and you're probably never going to work in media again. Which is pretty extraordinary. And yeah, a number of the people that I was speaking to, they did get cold feet about going public, under their own names, because they were worried it would damage their careers. I did actually speak to the New York Times reporter who wrote the story that we have on screen now and shared some information with her. But what's really interesting is that the FT was on the verge of publishing this expose about Nick Cohen, who was, a star Observer columnist, and had, during the initial Blair years, a reputation as being a bit of a radical in terms of attacking Blair from a left-wing position quite viciously at times. And then suddenly, in the wake of 9/11 and the eruption of the War on Terror, became a hardcore neocon in favor of Anglo-American military adventurism, the world over. Wrote entire books about how the left were actually in bed with fascists by token of not supporting the Iraq War. Was heavily protected, won awards, his books got stellar reviews in most mainstream newspapers. This was despite his absolutely rampant alcoholism and tendency towards sexual abuse being extremely well known. The FT was on the verge of busting him at long last in late 2022, and then the editor spiked it. And there are suggestions that the reason this happened was because the FT itself had its own internal problems with certain staffers who were, to use a euphemism, handsy with female members of staff. So yeah, it's a big club, and you're not part of it, and quite frankly, you're lucky you're not. Because it's full of human excrement, and finally, after numerous people pursued complaints against Cohen, and they led nowhere, finally he was let go. Without any formal explanation in the middle of 2023, and a lot of people, wished him the best of luck. A lot of fellow journalists, including his pal James Ball and James Bloodworth, they wished him well in his future endeavours, and he now runs a Substack, which has got quite a lot of subscribers, it seems. But yeah, there is a total. There was a total omerta on the extremely well-known, on Cohen's extremely well-known perverted proclivities, and he got away with it for years because, again, the media can't hold itself to account, even if journalists are committing very serious crimes.
Well, I think you hit upon the key point there, which is that this is a club, and also it serves a very specific ideological purpose for the British ruling class, which is, of course, ideological reinforcements, as we covered earlier. And if you get into the club, and you're of usage to them, you can commit all kinds of crimes, as Cohen did, and get away with it, just as within the corridors of power within the Catholic Church. If you committed horrible crimes but were, a useful chap to have around, you would be, of course, protected. And the way you advance up a bureaucracy in the imperialist nations, would be it the church bureaucracy, the journalistic bureaucracy, the state bureaucracy, is by having an ability to tell any lie convincingly, to having an ability to not be shocked or morally disgusted by the actions of your colleagues, and to, in actual fact, cover up for the crimes of your colleagues on a regular basis. It's that last element, that ability to lie consistently about the awful crimes that the people around you are committing, that will get you promoted up to, well, I don't know, so we say, the office of Prime Minister, because, of course, that is the background of our beloved Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. Now, this brings us to the end of this particular episode, series entitled Media Twats. Americans, I know you want your own series. Not taking that under consideration. You may well get your wish. But we wanted to start with British Media Twats, and believe me, we had to narrow this field down quite a lot just to get to this collection of slobbering criminals. More perhaps will be examined in future episodes, but until we join you again, and be sure to look out for our next show, which will be an interview with the American academic and dissenting intellectual Gabriel Rockhill. We will say farewell to you for this week, and be sure to check out our Substack, share our YouTube work. Spread the words. In fact, why don't you tag James Bloodworth or James Ball when doing so? I'm sure they'd be delighted to hear from us. And now I'll throw over to my comrade co-host in the Once and Future Socialist Yugoslavia, Kit, for the final word of this week.
Well, I mean, little more to add apart from, we hope that you've enjoyed this voyage through the ubiquitous twattery of the British media. There are so many other people we could have mentioned, should have mentioned, but we only have so much time, as do you. I think that a further special on the British media twats American counterparts is certainly in the offing. We also do have some exciting exclusive interviews and specials impending on a variety of topics. Our next big interview will be with Gabriel Rockhill, who is superb about the cultural Cold War and cultural infiltration by the intelligence services. Stay tuned for that. But there's a lot more to come. Thanks so much for joining us. Like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. God bless you. Take care.
Dreadful media twats, dreadful media twats, dreadful, dreadful, dreadful twats, terrible, dreadful media twats, dreadful, 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 dreadful twats. So it's dreadful, 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 dreadful media twats. Dreadful media twats, dreadful media twats, dreadful, dreadful media twats.